In a world that was once dark and silent, a spark was ignited, the spark of human thought, yearning to be remembered. Imagine a time when the only way to share a story was by speaking, when every conversation, every lesson, every moment lived in the fleeting air. But what happens when the human mind decides to make something permanent? What if ideas, once spoken and forgotten, could now be captured not just in the air, but in stone, in ink, in something that would survive long after the words had left the lips? This is where history begins. In caves deep within the earth, where early humans etched symbols on walls, not knowing that they were about to create a new form of immortality, the written word. Long before paper, before ink, before the books that now fill our libraries, there was a need to communicate, to preserve, to share knowledge across time. From the moment the first human carved a mark into a surface, the act of writing was born. And it didn't just change history, it shaped it. Writing wasn't simply about recording the past, it was about shaping the future. The ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, and Chinese didn't just use symbols, they wielded them as tools of power, wisdom, and legacy. Through their hands, the world learned how to pass knowledge, not just between individuals, but across generations. This journey, spanning centuries, moved through the rise of great civilizations, from the papyrus scrolls of Egypt to the ink-stained pages of ancient China. Writing was not just a skill, it was the backbone of empires, religions, and revolutions. It gave birth to ideas that shaped the very world we live in today. As we step into this fascinating journey through time, we'll explore how paper, ink, and brush carried knowledge from the dawn of civilization to the present day. It's a story of human ingenuity, a story about the drive to connect, to record, and to be remembered. But this journey doesn't stop here. If you're fascinated by how our past shapes our present, make sure to hit the like button. Share this story with your friends so they can join us in exploring the power of words and the incredible history behind them. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss another chapter of this epic journey through time. Let's begin the journey of paper, ink, and brush, the story of how knowledge was passed down through the ages. Imagine a world where ideas, once spoken, simply vanish into the air, leaving no trace behind. A world where every thought, every story, every lesson existed only in the moment, drifting away like the wind itself. Now, imagine the first time a human being made the decision to capture one of these thoughts, not through speech, but through something permanent. This was the beginning of writing, the moment when knowledge, once ephemeral, was transformed into something enduring. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't the result of a single grand idea, but a slow and steady evolution. In the caves and on the stones of our ancestors, the earliest forms of communication took shape. Humans began marking their world, not with words, but with symbols, small, simple, yet powerful enough to carry meaning across time and space. These first marks, carved into stone or painted on cave walls, were the ancestors of writing. They were not just pictures, they were attempts to capture something intangible. The story of how humans first decided that their thoughts were worth recording is a story of survival, of necessity, and ultimately, of immortality. And it begins in the most unlikely of places: caves, rocks, and pieces of clay. Picture the ancient world, a vast, untamed landscape. No cities, no great monuments, just endless wilderness. The early humans who lived in this world were not yet the builders of empires or the creators of written language. They were hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, living moment to moment. Yet, they began to see the world differently. In dark caves deep beneath the earth, these early humans began to leave their mark. These marks were not simple drawings of animals or abstract patterns. They were symbols, the first attempts at communication beyond speech. They represented animals, events, and sometimes even people. The markings on the walls of the caves were not just decoration, they were messages. They were a way of preserving knowledge for future generations. As the centuries passed, these early symbols began to evolve. The marks on the walls of caves turned into the first forms of written language. not yet refined but deeply significant. The idea was born. Ideas could be kept, preserved, and passed down. Far from the caves of early humans, in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, something extraordinary was happening. The Sumerians, a people who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, had begun to take the first steps toward what we now know as writing. It was called cuneiform, a system of writing that would shape the future of human civilization. Cuneiform was not born from the desire to tell stories or create art, but from the needs of a growing society. Trade, agriculture, and law were becoming increasingly complex, and the need to record transactions, inventories, and agreements became paramount. The Sumerians needed a way to track goods, to remember agreements, and to organize their cities. And so, they created the first writing system, a series of wedge-shaped marks made with a reed stylus on clay tablets. At first, these marks weren't even what we would consider true writing. They began as simple pictures, small symbols that represented real-world objects, a sheep, a cow, a basket. But over time, these simple pictures began to evolve, becoming more abstract and complex. The very first written words weren't simply representations of things, but representations of ideas. This was the birth of recorded thought of writing that was not just a way to represent objects, but a way to represent abstract concepts. For the first time, humans had a tool that allowed them to capture thoughts, ideas, and knowledge, not just in the moment, but for eternity. Meanwhile, far to the west, in the land of Egypt, another form of writing was taking shape: hieroglyphs. Unlike the functional cuneiform of the Sumerians, Egyptian hieroglyphs were not only a system of recording information, they were sacred. They were a way to communicate with the gods. Imagine the grand stone temples and the towering pyramids of ancient Egypt, where priests and scribes worked by candlelight, carefully carving symbols into the walls of tombs and temples. These symbols were not just letters or pictures, they were the very essence of divine communication. The ancient Egyptians believed that the written word had magical properties, that by inscribing the names of the gods or the king's titles, they could ensure immortality. Hieroglyphs were not easy to master. They were a complex system of symbols that represented not only objects, but also sounds and ideas. Writing in hieroglyphs was a skill passed down through generations of scribes, who carefully crafted each symbol, knowing that the fate of the nation, its laws, its beliefs, and its future rested upon their hands. But even as the Egyptians saw writing as a way to connect with the gods, they also understood its power as a tool of governance. The pharaohs used the written word to control, to organize, and to pass down their decrees. Laws, rituals, and histories were all recorded on papyrus scrolls and inscribed on the walls of temples, ensuring that their reign would be remembered for centuries to come. Why did early civilizations place such importance on writing? It wasn't just about practical concerns like trade or laws. There was a deeper, more profound need, the need to preserve knowledge for future generations. Early humans, much like us today, wanted to be remembered. They wanted their stories, their ideas, and their wisdom to outlast their own lives. In many ways, writing became humanity's first attempt at immortality. The Sumerian king who recorded his laws on a clay tablet didn't just want to create order in his lifetime, he wanted to ensure that his decisions would be remembered, that his legacy would live on. The Egyptian priest who carved sacred texts on stone wanted to connect with the divine, but also with the future. As writing began to spread, so did the idea that knowledge once lost could now be preserved, passed down, and built upon. Ideas were no longer fleeting. They could now be shared across time and space. In the quiet moments of those early societies, when symbols were carved into stone, the future was being written. Writing wasn't just a tool, it was the key to unlocking the vast storehouses of knowledge that would eventually form the foundation of our modern world. From the cave paintings of ancient humans to the towering stone tablets of the Sumerians and Egyptians, humanity began to shape its future with every symbol, every mark. What began as a means to record thoughts and events became something far more profound, a way to preserve, to share, and to pass down the knowledge of one generation to the next. As we move through the ages, we will see how this early desire to preserve knowledge would evolve and spread. From papyrus to parchment, from ink to print, the tools of writing would change, but the need to record and pass down knowledge would remain the same. And so, the journey of paper, ink, and brush began an unbroken chain of thought, from the distant past to the world we know today. As civilizations advanced, the written word began to evolve into something far more intricate, more profound, and ultimately more universal. Writing was no longer a tool of just one tribe or one kingdom. It began to spread across continents, from the Fertile Crescent to the banks of the Nile, and then to the far reaches of the East. From the earliest scratches on stone to the complex scripts of ancient empires, writing became humanity's most powerful tool for connecting people, preserving knowledge, and building empires. In the East, the story of writing took a different turn. As the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt flourished, a new kind of writing was emerging on the other side of the world. In China, a civilization that would rival the great empires of the West, writing began as a way to communicate with the divine, much like in Egypt. In ancient China, early characters were carved onto bones and shells, the first attempts at recording thoughts on oracle bones. These bones were used by diviners who would carve questions to the gods and record their answers, looking for signs that could guide their rulers. These early Chinese characters were simple yet profound, tied to the spiritual world, marking a crucial moment in the evolution of writing. The writing system was inseparable from the belief that words could influence the will of the gods, and so it became a bridge between the human and the divine. But Chinese writing would soon evolve. During the Zhou dynasty, writing began to serve not just as a means of spiritual connection, but also as a practical tool for government and record-keeping. By the time of the Han dynasty, the written word had already become a pillar of Chinese society, used for everything from the recording of royal decrees to the documentation of history. The most iconic of these texts was the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, which would lay the groundwork for Chinese historical writing for centuries to come. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were not the only ones pioneering the written word. As their culture spread, so did their writing system. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Akkadians continued to refine cuneiform, using it to record their laws, contracts, and epics. Most famously, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This early work of literature, written in cuneiform, would go on to influence countless generations, reaching far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. As the Persian Empire rose, so did the influence of writing. The Persians used cuneiform, but they also adapted it to their own language, creating a distinct form of writing that would help bind their vast empire together. Similarly, the Phoenicians, famous for their seafaring and trading, contributed greatly to the spread of writing. They created the first alphabetic script, a system of symbols that represented sounds rather than whole words or objects. This revolutionary idea would eventually influence the Greek alphabet, and from there, the Roman alphabet, laying the foundation for much of the writing systems we use today. As the written word spread, so did the empires that used it. In Egypt, the pharaohs saw writing as both a tool for governance and a way to immortalize their rule. The Rosetta Stone, discovered centuries later, would unlock the mystery of hieroglyphs and open the doors to understanding an entire civilization. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes, was inscribed in stone and displayed for all to see. Writing became the very foundation of law, governance, and administration, ensuring that the commands of kings would not fade away with the passage of time. In the Roman Empire, writing was integral to the functioning of the state. The Romans used writing to record laws, treaties, and history, but they also used it for communication between the provinces. Julius Caesar's Commentarii, his personal account of his campaigns in Gaul, served not only as a historical record but also as a political tool, shaping the image of the leader who would become an emperor. This practice of using writing as both a tool for governance and a way to communicate with subjects and allies would echo throughout history. As civilizations grew and expanded, so too did the networks that facilitated the flow of knowledge. Trade routes, like the Silk Road, connected the East and West, allowing for the exchange of not only goods but also ideas. Through these exchanges, writing systems spread, adapted, and flourished. In the Middle East, Islamic scholars preserved the ancient texts of Greek philosophers and scholars, translating them into Arabic and expanding upon them in ways that would later inspire the Renaissance. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, during the Islamic Golden Age, became a hub of knowledge where scholars gathered from all corners of the world to translate, write, and teach. These scholars did not merely preserve the past, they advanced it. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy flourished under their hands. They took the works of Aristotle, Plato, and others and built upon them, creating new knowledge that would eventually find its way into Europe during the Renaissance. By the time the medieval period had begun in Europe, the written word had already been entrenched as a cornerstone of civilization. The monasteries of medieval Europe became the keepers of knowledge, where monks painstakingly copied ancient manuscripts by hand. These scribes preserved the knowledge of classical antiquity, but they also contributed to the creation of new texts, books on theology, philosophy, and science, laying the groundwork for the intellectual rebirth that would follow in the Renaissance. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century, would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of writing. For the first time in history, books could be mass-produced, making knowledge far more accessible. This technological revolution would spark a cultural revolution, leading to the spread of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. Writing had come a long way since the first marks on cave walls. It had moved from the hands of the few to the hands of the many. It had evolved from simple symbols to intricate scripts, from sacred texts to scientific formulas. As the centuries passed, writing remained a constant force, adapting, growing, and spreading, carrying with it the stories, ideas, and knowledge that would shape the course of human history. And so, as we trace the journey of writing from its earliest beginnings, we see a continuous thread weaving its way through the tapestry of civilization. From the marks on cave walls to the printed books of the Renaissance, from the scrolls of the Egyptians to the digital screens of today, the written word has carried humanity's knowledge, stories, and dreams across time. The tools have changed, but the need to preserve, share, and pass on knowledge remains as vital as ever. The journey of paper, ink, and brush began an unbroken chain of thought, from the distant past to the world we know today. The world was changing. As civilizations grew, so did their need to communicate, to govern, and to preserve their legacy. Writing, once a simple necessity to record trade and laws, began to take on a new role, a role of immense power and influence. In Egypt, one of the greatest ancient empires, writing transformed into an instrument of political control, spiritual significance, and immortality. The Egyptians, whose civilization flourished along the banks of the Nile for thousands of years, were among the first to understand the profound power of writing. Unlike the Sumerians who carved their symbols onto clay, the Egyptians had something different. They had papyrus. This remarkable material would become synonymous with their written language and would carry their knowledge across time into the hands of generations to come. Papyrus, made from the reed of the same name, was the perfect medium for writing. It was light, flexible, and durable, ideal for creating scrolls and manuscripts. Unlike clay tablets, which could break and were difficult to transport, papyrus could be rolled up and carried with ease, allowing for the creation of vast libraries and archives. Writing became more than just a tool for merchants or bureaucrats. It was a means of shaping the very future of Egypt. The Egyptians were also the first to develop a formal system of writing hieroglyphs. These intricate symbols were not just for recording laws or trading information. They were sacred. Each symbol had a deeper meaning, often relating to divine forces or the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, writing was a direct link between the human world and the divine. In the great temples, scribes would carve hieroglyphs onto the walls, telling the stories of pharaohs, gods, and the triumphs of the empire. These carvings were not only designed to memorialize the past, they were tools of propaganda, ensuring that the deeds of the kings would endure for eternity. In this way, writing became an integral part of the pharaoh's power, for it gave them not only control over the present, but the ability to shape their legacy for the future. The role of the scribe in ancient Egypt was one of profound significance. The scribes were the educated elite, trained in the complex art of writing hieroglyphs. They were responsible for recording everything from religious texts and royal decrees to the daily activities of the people. A scribe's work was considered sacred. They were the conduits between the gods and the rulers, ensuring that the words spoken by the pharaoh were preserved for eternity. Unlike most other civilizations, where literacy was often limited to the ruling class, the Egyptians developed an entire class of scribes who played a central role in the bureaucracy of the empire. These scribes worked not only in temples and royal palaces, but also in the expanding administrative offices across Egypt. Their work was essential to the functioning of the state, as it allowed for the management of land, taxes, and laws. Without the scribes, the vast Egyptian empire would not have been able to function on the scale that it did. But writing was not just a tool of administration, it was also a spiritual practice. Many of the most important texts in Egypt were religious in nature. The Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife, was one of the most widely copied texts in ancient Egypt. It was written on papyrus scrolls, placed in the tombs of the deceased to guide them through the perilous journey to the afterlife. These texts were often accompanied by stunning illustrations, depicting gods, pharaohs, and scenes from the world beyond the grave. The scribes who wrote and illustrated these texts were not only recording the will of the gods, they were also performing a divine duty. The role of the scribe in Egyptian society was revered. It was a job that was passed down through generations, and the art of writing was carefully guarded and taught. To be a scribe was to have access to knowledge and power, for it was through writing that Egypt's rulers could control both their empire and their afterlife. While papyrus revolutionized writing in Egypt, it also paved the way for a legacy of knowledge that would outlast the Egyptian empire. Perhaps the greatest symbol of this legacy was the Library of Alexandria, the most famous library in the ancient world, and a center of knowledge that would influence countless generations. Founded in the 3rd century BCE by Ptolemy II, the Library of Alexandria was more than just a repository of books. It was a place where scholars from all over the ancient world came together to share ideas, to translate texts, and to contribute to the great intellectual tradition of the Mediterranean world. The library housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, many written on papyrus, containing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria was not only a center for the preservation of Egyptian knowledge, but also a meeting point for cultures. The Egyptian scribes who had perfected the art of writing were now joined by scholars from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond, all contributing to the creation of an intellectual hub that would change the course of history. The library's destruction, which occurred over several centuries, marked the loss of an immense treasure trove of knowledge, a tragedy that has left the world wondering what might have been preserved had it remained intact. The impact of papyrus extended far beyond Egypt's borders. As Egyptian influence spread throughout the Mediterranean, so too did the use of papyrus. The Greeks, Romans, and other civilizations adopted the material, ensuring that writing and knowledge would spread across the ancient world. Papyrus became the most commonly used material for writing in the ancient Mediterranean, surpassing even other forms like parchment. The Greeks in particular were influenced by the Egyptian tradition of writing on papyrus, and many of their greatest texts, from the works of Homer to the philosophical musings of Plato, were written on this material. The widespread use of papyrus also allowed for the flourishing of literature. By the time of the Roman Empire, papyrus scrolls were being used not only for religious and administrative purposes, but also for the creation of books that would define the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. The written word became more accessible, allowing ideas to be exchanged more freely and to be preserved for future generations. The Egyptians had not only created the material on which much of the ancient world's written knowledge would be preserved, they had also established the cultural and intellectual traditions that would shape the future of writing. Writing, once a simple means of record-keeping, had become a powerful tool in the hands of rulers, priests, and scholars. It was no longer just about preserving knowledge. It was about controlling the flow of information, shaping the future, and immortalizing the past. In ancient Egypt, the written word was inseparable from the power of the pharaohs, and papyrus became the vessel that carried the knowledge and legacy of the empire. Through the art of writing, Egypt had laid the foundation for the intellectual and cultural legacy of the ancient world, and in doing so, had secured its place in history. Papyrus, once the secret weapon of Egypt, was soon adopted by civilizations beyond the Nile. Its spread marked a turning point in the history of knowledge and communication. As Egypt's influence grew, so too did the use of papyrus in the Mediterranean world. The material, light and durable, became the chosen medium for scholars, scribes, and rulers across continents, allowing knowledge to travel further and faster than ever before. The Greeks, ever curious and quick to adopt the innovations of other cultures, recognized the power of papyrus. The use of this material allowed them to document their great philosophical works and historical accounts. Homer's epic poems, the foundations of Western literature, were penned on papyrus scrolls, allowing them to survive the passage of time. Similarly, the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Herodotus, among others, were preserved on papyrus, setting the stage for the intellectual revolution that would come to define Greek thought. The Egyptians, who had long used papyrus for religious texts and bureaucratic records, had inadvertently laid the foundation for the intellectual explosion of the Greek and Roman worlds. The Egyptians were not just the creators of papyrus, they were the creators of a tradition of writing that allowed ideas to be shared across vast distances and across generations. This was a monumental step in the evolution of the written word. As the Roman Empire rose, papyrus remained an integral part of the administrative and intellectual landscape. The Romans adopted the use of papyrus for their legal documents, governmental records, and for the flourishing of literature. The Roman Empire, vast and sprawling, relied heavily on written communication. Without papyrus, there would have been no efficient way to govern such an enormous territory. From legal codes to the writings of poets like Virgil and Ovid, the Roman world was built on the written word, and much of it was preserved on papyrus scrolls. Yet, as the empire expanded and papyrus became more widespread, it was not without challenges. The cost of papyrus was not insignificant, and as the empire grew, the demand for writing materials increased. This led to the invention of parchment, a more durable and affordable alternative. However, papyrus continued to hold its place as the material of choice for scholars, historians, and philosophers, and it remained in use for centuries to come. The role of papyrus in the spread of knowledge cannot be overstated. It was not just a tool of communication, it was a tool of empire building. The ability to record laws, royal decrees, military strategies, and trade agreements in written form allowed empires to maintain control over vast regions. It was papyrus that carried the knowledge of the ancient world from Egypt to Greece, from Rome to the farthest reaches of the empire. Through papyrus, the ancient world was connected, its knowledge preserved, and its legacies ensured. The rise of the Library of Alexandria marked another significant chapter in the story of papyrus. Founded by Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BCE, the library became the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Scholars from all corners of the Mediterranean came to study, share ideas, and copy texts. The library housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, many of them written on papyrus, covering every field of knowledge known at the time. It was a place where the greatest minds of antiquity gathered, where ideas were exchanged and preserved for future generations. While the library was a beacon of knowledge, it was not immune to the ravages of time. The library was destroyed over several centuries in a series of fires and attacks, and with it, much of the written knowledge of the ancient world was lost. Yet, the spirit of Alexandria lived on. The texts that had once been housed in the great library found their way into the hands of scholars across the Mediterranean, ensuring that the knowledge of the ancients would continue to shape the world. As papyrus spread, so did the idea of knowledge as a tool for power. Writing was no longer just about recording transactions or documenting events. It was about shaping the future. The written word became a weapon of control. Rulers could send messages across vast distances, maintain control over their territories, and manipulate public opinion. The ability to write was no longer confined to the elite few. It became a tool used by those who sought to maintain or expand their power. The transition from papyrus to parchment, and later to paper, did not diminish the power of writing, it only enhanced it. Knowledge became more accessible, more widespread, and more powerful. What began with the Egyptians, who invented the medium of papyrus, would go on to shape the very world we live in today. The power of papyrus was not just in the material itself, but in its ability to connect people. It allowed ideas to travel across continents, across cultures, and through time. It enabled the preservation of knowledge that would shape entire civilizations. The Egyptian scribes, whose careful hands recorded the history of their pharaohs, unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would bring about the age of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Renaissance thinking. As the world moved into the Middle Ages, papyrus remained a critical tool for preserving knowledge. It was the monks in the monasteries of Europe who took up the mantle of preserving the texts of the ancients. The works of the Greeks and Romans, once thought lost, were revived in the libraries of medieval Europe, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of the ancient world would endure. Papyrus had laid the groundwork for the preservation of knowledge, and it would continue to play a role in the transmission of ideas for centuries to come. By the time of the Renaissance, a new age of human achievement, the printing press had revolutionized the way knowledge was shared, but it was still papyrus in its heyday that enabled the great minds of antiquity to create the foundational texts that would inspire the world's greatest philosophers, scientists, and writers. The written word, carried on papyrus scrolls, had given birth to the Age of Enlightenment, when ideas would continue to evolve, spread, and change the world. Papyrus, a simple material created from the humble papyrus reed, became a tool of profound importance in the history of humanity. It carried the stories of empires, the knowledge of scholars, and the ideas of thinkers across time. It was the medium through which ideas were shared, preserved, and immortalized. In ancient Egypt, it became the instrument through which rulers maintained control and established their legacies. In Greece and Rome, it became the means through which intellectual thought was recorded and passed down. And in Alexandria, it was the vessel that carried the knowledge of the ancient world, ensuring that the spirit of learning and discovery would continue long after the ancient world had passed away. The legacy of papyrus lives on today. It was the starting point of the written word, the foundation upon which all other forms of writing were built. Without papyrus, much of the knowledge we take for granted today might have been lost to the sands of time. The Egyptian scribes, the Greek philosophers, the Roman emperors, and the scholars of the ancient world all owed their immortality to the power of writing and to the humble reed that carried their ideas into eternity. As the ancient world's greatest empires flourished, one civilization began to carve its own path in the history of writing. In China, a culture that would become one of the world's oldest and most enduring, writing took on a form unlike any other. Far from the papyrus scrolls of Egypt and the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, China's earliest writings were etched not on stone or clay, but on bamboo and silk. The materials were different, but the desire to record knowledge, preserve power, and connect generations was the same. The origins of Chinese writing trace back to the Shang dynasty, circa 1600–1046 BCE, where the earliest known form of Chinese writing appeared on oracle bones, animal bones, or turtle shells. These bones were used by diviners, individuals who communicated with the gods to foretell the future. They carved inscriptions on these bones, asking the gods for guidance, making the practice deeply spiritual. The symbols on the bones were not random marks. They were the earliest manifestations of a writing system that would endure for millennia. The Shang diviners would ask questions, seeking answers to matters of state, agriculture, health, and fate. After carving the questions into the bones, they would heat the bones until they cracked, and then interpret the cracks to divine answers. As part of the process, the question itself was inscribed on the bones in the form of early Chinese characters, which were simple, pictorial symbols that depicted real-world objects and ideas. These inscriptions were sacred, a direct link between the earthly and the divine. This early writing, created by the diviners, was not only a means of communication but also a sacred tool of governance. It was through these inscriptions that the rulers of the Shang dynasty could seek divine guidance for their decisions. Over time, these oracle bone inscriptions evolved into a more complex system, leading to the creation of what would eventually become one of the world's most enduring writing systems. The transition from oracle bones to more widespread forms of writing came during the Zhou dynasty, 1046–256 BCE, a period when the use of writing expanded beyond divination to include historical records, government decrees, and even literary works. During this time, the Chinese writing system began to take its more recognizable form. The characters that appeared on the oracle bones evolved into a more complex system of logograms, each character representing a word or a concept rather than just a sound. By the time of the Qin dynasty, 221–206 BCE, when China was unified under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the written word had become essential to the governance of the empire. It was during the Qin dynasty that the standardized script known as small seal script was created. This standardized system of writing allowed for better communication across the vast empire and was a crucial tool in maintaining order, particularly as China expanded and connected diverse regions. The use of this standardized writing system ensured that the emperor's decrees, legal codes, and government communications could be understood by all subjects of the empire, regardless of regional dialects. The importance of writing in ancient China was not merely practical, it was deeply philosophical and spiritual. To the Chinese, writing was a powerful means of connecting the earthly realm to the divine, the past to the future, and individuals to the collective knowledge of society. The Confucian tradition, which would come to dominate Chinese thought, placed great emphasis on the preservation of knowledge and the importance of learning. Confucius himself believed that through education and study of the ancient texts, individuals could achieve moral enlightenment and contribute to the harmony of society. As the Qin dynasty fell, and the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, rose, China's writing system continued to evolve, reflecting the cultural and intellectual growth of the empire. The Han dynasty was marked by the flourishing of literature and historical writing, and the Chinese writing system expanded to include more complex characters. The Han dynasty scholars compiled the historical text known as the Records of the Grand Historian, Shiji, one of the most important historical works in Chinese literature. It was during this time that writing truly became the cornerstone of intellectual and governmental life in China. The most significant contribution of the Han dynasty was the invention of paper. Paper, made from bamboo, wood pulp, and other plant fibers, was far cheaper to produce than silk or bamboo strips, which had been the primary writing materials. The invention of paper revolutionized writing, making it far more accessible. Paper allowed writing to spread beyond the elite scribes and scholars, enabling greater access to education, communication, and governance. The Han dynasty's innovation in writing materials would have a profound effect on China and eventually the rest of the world. At the same time that paper was beginning to replace bamboo and silk, the Chinese brush was becoming the tool of choice for writing. The Chinese brush, a simple yet powerful tool, allowed for both precision and beauty in writing. Calligraphy became an art form, with each stroke of the brush imbued with meaning and spirit. The practice of calligraphy soon became one of the most highly regarded arts in Chinese culture, and the written word itself came to be viewed as a reflection of the writer's inner character and moral integrity. While paper and brush would eventually spread throughout China and to other parts of East Asia, the use of silk remained an important element in Chinese writing for centuries. Silk scrolls were used for important official documents, historical records, and artwork, particularly in the realm of painting and calligraphy. The Chinese were some of the first to understand that writing was not just about communication, it was about preserving culture, philosophy, and identity. The cultural importance of writing in China cannot be overstated. Unlike in many other cultures, where writing was reserved primarily for administrative or commercial purposes, in China, writing was seen as an expression of cultural continuity. The Chinese writing system, with its thousands of characters, remained remarkably stable for over 2 millennia. The character-based writing system was not just a practical tool, it was the means by which Chinese civilization preserved its collective memory, philosophy, and cultural identity. As Chinese writing evolved over the centuries, it influenced neighboring cultures in East Asia, such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, all of which adopted Chinese characters in one form or another. The spread of Chinese characters and the principles of Chinese calligraphy laid the foundation for a shared cultural and intellectual heritage across much of East Asia. As China's writing system continued to evolve, its influence began to spread far beyond the borders of the empire. The expansion of Chinese culture, philosophy, and governance was closely tied to the dissemination of its writing system. The adoption of Chinese characters by neighboring countries marked a crucial chapter in the global history of writing. During the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, China reached a period of extraordinary cultural and intellectual growth. The Silk Road, which had already connected China to the West, facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge between China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Through these exchanges, Chinese writing spread across the Asian continent, shaping the development of writing systems in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. In Japan, the influence of Chinese writing began with the introduction of Chinese characters in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Initially, the Japanese adopted the Chinese system directly, using Chinese characters for their own spoken language. Over time, however, the Japanese adapted the system to suit their needs, creating their own syllabic scripts, hiragana and katakana. These two scripts, while based on Chinese characters, were designed to represent sounds rather than concepts. The Japanese writing system today is a blend of these two indigenous scripts and kanji, which are Chinese characters still used for many nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Similarly, in Korea, the introduction of Chinese characters had a profound impact on the development of their own writing system. Hanja, the use of Chinese characters in Korean, became widespread, particularly in literary and scholarly works. However, in the 15th century, during the Joseon dynasty, King Sejong the Great sought to make writing more accessible to the Korean people. He introduced Hangul, a phonetic alphabet, which was designed to represent the sounds of the Korean language more accurately than Chinese characters. While Hanja continued to be used in Korea for centuries, Hangul gradually replaced it, creating a unique writing system for the Korean people. In Vietnam, Chinese characters were used for over 1,000 years, beginning during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, when Vietnam was under Chinese rule. The Vietnamese adopted chur nom, a system that used Chinese characters to represent native Vietnamese words and sounds. Despite its complexity, chur nom remained in use until the 20th century. when the Vietnamese language was simplified and written using the Latin alphabet. Thus, the impact of Chinese writing extended far beyond the borders of China itself. The spread of Chinese characters helped to create a shared cultural and intellectual heritage across East Asia, uniting these nations in their appreciation of the written word. The transmission of Chinese knowledge, through its writing system, played a vital role in the cultural exchange that shaped much of East Asia's history. Beyond East Asia, the influence of Chinese writing extended even further. The Silk Road was not just a trade route for goods, it was a highway for knowledge. Buddhism, which had originated in India, spread to China via the Silk Road, and Chinese translations of Buddhist texts had a profound effect on the religious and philosophical traditions of East Asia. As these texts were translated, they were often written in Chinese characters, reinforcing the deep connection between writing and the transmission of ideas. The Buddhist monks who traveled along the Silk Road were instrumental in spreading Chinese translations of sacred texts. Sanskrit, the language of many early Buddhist texts, was often transliterated into Chinese characters, and in some cases, Sanskrit words were adapted into Chinese to facilitate their pronunciation and understanding. These translations and adaptations had a lasting impact on Buddhism's development in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, where it became integrated into local traditions. Meanwhile, in China itself, the use of writing continued to evolve. With the invention of printing technology during the Tang and Song dynasties, the dissemination of knowledge reached unprecedented levels. Woodblock printing, developed in the 9th century, allowed for the mass production of books, a significant technological advancement. By the 11th century, the Song dynasty saw the creation of movable type printing, which made printing even more efficient and accessible. These innovations allowed for the spread of knowledge throughout China and later to the rest of the world. Printing revolutionized the way knowledge was shared in China. Scholars and intellectuals could now access books in unprecedented numbers. The classics of Confucianism, Buddhist sutras, and works of poetry, philosophy, and science were now available to a broader audience. As the use of printing spread across East Asia, it helped create a shared intellectual foundation, one that transcended the boundaries of any single nation. This was one of the key developments that paved the way for the Renaissance in Europe centuries later, when similar printing technologies would ignite a period of intellectual and artistic flourishing. The spread of paper and printing was not limited to China alone. Paper-making technology, which had been developed in China during the Han Dynasty, made its way to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. The earliest records of paper-making in the Islamic world date back to the 8th century, when the Abbasid Caliphate established a paper mill in Baghdad. The Mamluks in Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually Europe all adopted paper-making techniques, which revolutionized communication and intellectual exchange. In Europe, the spread of printing press technology in the 15th century would forever change the course of history. The printing press, which was developed by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany, made it possible to mass-produce books, dramatically reducing their cost and increasing access to knowledge. This democratization of knowledge would lay the groundwork for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, all of which were fueled by the ability to disseminate information on a much larger scale. As the world transitioned from handwritten manuscripts to printed texts, the written word continued to serve as the foundation for learning, governance, and culture. The Chinese writing system, with its profound influence on East Asia and the technological innovations of the Tang, Song, and later Ming dynasties, played an essential role in the creation of the intellectual and technological foundation that would influence the world for centuries to come. As civilizations grew and empires expanded, the role of writing transcended mere record-keeping and governance. It became a sacred act, an instrument through which divine will was recorded. Rituals were codified, and faiths were spread across the world. From the Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament to the scriptures of the Quran, writing became not only the means of preserving history, but also a method for conveying spiritual truths to future generations. In the ancient world, The first written religious texts were inscribed on materials that would last: the sacred tablets, scrolls, and papyrus that carried the words of the gods, not just as a cultural artifact, but as the word itself. These texts would not only shape the religious landscape of their own time, but continue to resonate throughout centuries, shaping the world's religions and their cultures. The Hebrew Bible, for example, was passed down through generations, not only through oral traditions, but through the written word, carved into stone tablets and inscribed on scrolls of parchment. These texts held both religious and legal significance. The Torah, the central reference of the Jewish faith, was written by scribes who carefully transcribed the laws given to Moses. These writings were not simply records. They were divinely inspired laws meant to guide the people of Israel. It was through these sacred texts that the Jewish people were bound together, their faith preserved across time and space. In the Christian tradition, the Bible's story continued to unfold. The Christian Bible, consisting of the Old Testament and New Testament, was written over several centuries. The spread of Christianity would lead to the mass production of religious texts across Europe and the Mediterranean world. Early Christian manuscripts, written by hand in monasteries across Europe, were not only prized possessions but sacred tools used to bring people closer to God. These manuscripts were written in Latin and Greek, the languages of the Christian holy texts, and often featured illustrations, some of which were elaborate illuminations of the biblical stories that told as much about the faith as the text itself. Monastic life in the Middle Ages centered around the production of these manuscripts. Monks, who lived in secluded communities, dedicated their lives to copying the sacred scriptures, preserving them for future generations. These manuscript copies, written with quill pens and ink, were labor-intensive but revered for their spiritual significance. The illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period, which adorned the margins of texts with intricate designs and symbols, became an art form in their own right. It wasn't just Christian religious texts that were meticulously copied and spread across the world. In the Islamic world, the Quran, the holy book of Islam, was preserved and transcribed with the same reverence and devotion. The Quran was believed to be the direct word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Jibril. As Islam spread across the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa, so too did the written word of the Quran. Arabic calligraphy became an art form in its own right, with scribes dedicating their lives to writing and decorating the Quran. The practice of writing the Quran was not just a task of transcription, it was seen as a form of worship. The script used to write the Quran, known as kufich, and later the more flowing naskh, was designed to be both legible and aesthetic. The Quran was not merely written, it was crafted, with each letter drawn with careful precision. The early manuscripts of the Quran, which were written on parchment or papyrus, would later be copied in vast quantities and distributed across the Muslim world. As Islam expanded, the written Quran became central to the spread of Islamic culture and governance. The Quranic script was used to record legal codes, theological texts, and philosophical treatises. Like in Christian monasteries, Islamic scholars in regions like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo dedicated themselves to copying and preserving texts, ensuring that the knowledge of the ancients, as well as the new insights of Islamic scholars, would be passed down through generations. These texts, written by hand with ink and reed pens, were carefully stored in libraries and scriptoria, which became hubs for intellectual and spiritual study. Across India, the Vedic texts, which form the foundation of Hinduism, were also recorded on palm leaves and bamboo strips, meticulously transcribed by priests and scholars. These texts, written in Sanskrit, were considered sacred and were passed down from generation to generation. The Rig Veda, the oldest of these texts, consists of hymns and chants that were originally passed down orally before being transcribed onto these leaves. The written word allowed for the preservation of the Vedic teachings, ensuring that sacred knowledge would be retained and shared for centuries. In East Asia, Buddhist scriptures were similarly transcribed by hand, first on palm leaves and later on paper. These sacred texts were not just a record of the Buddha's teachings. They were considered a means of imparting wisdom to all who read them. Chinese Buddhist monks played a crucial role in transcribing these texts, often producing beautiful manuscripts that were decorated with calligraphy and illustrations. These Buddhist manuscripts, written in classical Chinese, were not only religious documents, but also a means of spreading Buddhism across East Asia. The art of manuscript making in these early religious traditions was not merely a mechanical task, it was an act of devotion. Writing, for many of these scribes, was an act of worship. By copying religious texts, they believed they were bringing the divine closer to the people, preserving the eternal truths of their faith. The act of transcribing these manuscripts became as sacred as the words themselves, with calligraphy and illumination transforming the page into a work of art and spiritual expression. While papyrus and parchment were the primary materials used in many of the ancient religious manuscripts, the spread of paper, which had been invented in China, further facilitated the growth and accessibility of religious texts. The printing press, invented in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg, would later allow these sacred texts to be mass-produced, making them more accessible to the general public and fundamentally changing the way knowledge and faith were shared. Through the written word, religions from Judaism to Christianity, from Islam to Hinduism, and from Buddhism to other spiritual traditions, were able to preserve their beliefs, spread their influence, and shape civilizations. The written scriptures were more than just documents. They were sacred vessels that carried the divine message across time, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients would never be lost. The written word continued to play a crucial role in shaping the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural landscapes of the ancient world. As religious texts spread across empires and kingdoms, the written word became more than just a means of communication. It became an instrument of power, identity, and faith. From the scrolls of the ancient Hebrews to the Islamic calligraphy adorning the walls of mosques, the power of the written word in religious traditions cannot be overstated. With the rise of Christianity, religious manuscripts began to spread far beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. Early Christians, who were persecuted and often forced to worship in secret, had no choice but to preserve their sacred texts in secret as well. The New Testament, the sacred writings about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, was written down in the early centuries of the Common Era. Gospels, letters, and other texts were copied by hand, and these manuscripts were circulated among the Christian communities. As Christianity gained followers and power, the creation and copying of these religious manuscripts became more widespread. The Catholic Church became a central institution for the production of sacred texts, and monasteries played a critical role in copying and preserving manuscripts. Scribes in these religious centers were entrusted with the important work of transcribing Christian scriptures, and they carefully copied these texts onto parchment or vellum, which were durable and long-lasting. The process of illuminating manuscripts, decorating the text with intricate designs, gold leaf, and illustrations, became a significant aspect of medieval Christian art. The Book of Kells, an illuminated manuscript created by monks in Ireland around the 9th century, is one of the most famous examples of this sacred art. The beautiful and detailed designs were not only an artistic expression of devotion, but also an act of worship, as each manuscript was seen as a holy object. The monks who crafted these manuscripts believed that their work was an extension of their faith and that they were helping to transmit the divine message to others. The Islamic world, which rose to prominence during the early medieval period, also placed great importance on written texts. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, was believed to be the literal word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. As Islam spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, the written Quran became central to Islamic life and culture. Arabic calligraphy became an art form, and Quranic manuscripts were produced with remarkable precision. Islamic scribes developed beautiful, flowing scripts such as Kufic and Naskh, which were used to transcribe the Quran. Unlike the Christian illuminated manuscripts, Islamic Quranic texts were traditionally not decorated with images. as Islamic law prohibits the depiction of human form. Instead, the focus was on the beauty of the written word itself, with intricate patterns and calligraphy designed to elevate the sacredness of the text. Quranic manuscripts, carefully written by hand on parchment or paper, were cherished as holy objects. The art of calligraphy became a deeply spiritual practice, and those who engaged in it were seen as performing a sacred duty. The spread of the Quran, through these beautifully written manuscripts, helped to unite the vast territories of the Islamic world. These texts were read, recited, and memorized, and they formed the foundation of both Islamic religious practice and Islamic civilization. While the religious manuscripts of Christianity and Islam were being copied by hand, a major shift in the production of texts occurred with the advent of printing technology. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the way that texts were produced and distributed. Books, religious and secular, could now be printed quickly and in large quantities. The Gutenberg Bible, the first major book printed with movable type, was a landmark achievement. It made the Bible more accessible to a wider audience, breaking down barriers to religious knowledge and empowering individuals to engage with Scripture on their own. The spread of the printing press, especially in Europe, marked the beginning of a new era in the dissemination of religious and intellectual ideas. While Christian texts became widely available, this new technology also enabled the spread of the Protestant Reformation, as Martin Luther's 95 Theses and other reformist writings were printed and circulated across Europe. The ability to mass-produce religious texts and ideas contributed to the religious revolution that transformed Christianity and laid the foundation for the modern age. At the same time, the spread of paper and printing technology began to reach other parts of the world. In China, where paper had been invented centuries earlier, the use of printing technology began to spread during the Song dynasty, 961,279 CE. The Chinese, who had developed movable type printing before Gutenberg, used this technology to print Buddhist scriptures, legal texts, and scholarly works. Printing in China allowed for the preservation and distribution of knowledge across the vast empire, and it contributed to the flourishing of Chinese scholarship and intellectual culture. In the Islamic world, the development of printing was slower. Due to religious prohibitions against the mass production of sacred texts, Quranic manuscripts were still copied by hand, and calligraphy remained the preferred method of transcription. However, the invention of printing in the West eventually reached the Islamic world, and over time, printing presses were established in key cities like Istanbul and Cairo. These printing presses produced not only religious texts but also scientific works, contributing to the intellectual exchange between the East and West. As printing technology spread across the globe, it became a global force for knowledge and communication. The production of religious manuscripts, once limited to the painstaking efforts of scribes, became a widespread practice. Printed Bibles, Qurans, and other sacred texts were distributed across nations, allowing for the global spread of religious ideas. The printing press helped to create a shared intellectual culture, with religious and philosophical texts circulating more freely and widely than ever before. In the ancient world, trade was not just about the exchange of goods, it was also about the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and technologies. One of the most important trade routes in human history, known as the Silk Road, was a conduit for not just silks and spices, but also for the spread of writing, paper, and intellectual traditions across vast distances. This trade route connected the East to the West, and through it, the written word made its way from China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and ultimately Europe. The origin of the Silk Road dates back to the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, when China sought to establish connections with the people of Central Asia and beyond. The name Silk Road itself is derived from one of the most valuable commodities traded along the route, silk. However, the route was not limited to just trade in luxury goods. It was a bridge for the exchange of ideas, and it played a key role in spreading Chinese writing, paper, and printing technology to the West. While China had already developed its writing system centuries earlier, the widespread use of paper as a medium for writing was a major breakthrough. Paper, invented in China during the Han Dynasty, was far cheaper and more versatile than the materials that had been used previously, such as bamboo, silk, or parchment. It allowed for the production of books and manuscripts on a scale never before seen, and its eventual spread through Central Asia and into Europe would revolutionize the written word. The journey of paper from China to the West began in the 7th century, when paper-making techniques made their way along the Silk Road. The first to adopt paper outside of China were the Arabs. By the time the Abbasid Caliphate was established in Baghdad in the 8th century, the Arabic-speaking world had fully embraced the use of paper. Baghdad, the intellectual and cultural center of the Islamic world, became the hub for paper production in the Middle East. The House of Wisdom, an academic institution that attracted scholars from all over the world, was instrumental in preserving the ancient texts of Greece and Persia, and it also played a key role in translating them into Arabic. As paper-making spread through the Middle East, the Islamic world became a center of scholarship. The Arabs not only preserved classical Greek and Roman texts, but also contributed significantly to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The written word, now transcribed on paper, was vital to this intellectual flourishing. Paper allowed for the mass production of manuscripts, making knowledge more accessible and enabling scholars to share their discoveries. By the 12th century, paper-making techniques had spread across the Mediterranean and into Europe, where they were embraced by the Christian scholars of the time. Paper was essential to the spread of learning, especially during the Renaissance, when knowledge from the classical world was rediscovered and translated into Latin. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, would further accelerate the spread of printed books and scholarship throughout Europe, ultimately leading to the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. As paper spread westward, it transformed not only the intellectual landscape of the world, but also the way in which trade, religion, and governance functioned. Written contracts, legal codes, and religious texts could now be mass-produced and distributed on a scale that was unimaginable before the invention of paper. It was no longer just the elite who had access to written knowledge, it was available to the masses. Paper democratized knowledge, breaking down the barriers that had long kept intellectual and spiritual traditions in the hands of the few. But the spread of paper and written knowledge along the Silk Road was not limited to the West. As it moved westward, it continued to play a role in the exchange of ideas between the East and the West. Chinese inventions like compass navigation and gunpowder also spread through the Silk Road, significantly impacting warfare, exploration, and navigation in the West. However, it was writing and paper that played an especially crucial role in ensuring that intellectual and cultural ideas from the East were integrated into Western thought. As the Middle Ages progressed, the Islamic world continued to serve as an intermediary between the East and the West. Scholars in Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad were instrumental in translating and preserving not only religious texts but also works of science and philosophy. The translation movement in the House of Wisdom translated Greek philosophical texts into Arabic, and these were later translated into Latin, allowing Western scholars access to the foundational works of Plato, Aristotle, and Galileo. These texts became a crucial part of the intellectual foundation for the Renaissance. The connection between the East and West via the Silk Road also led to the spread of religion. Buddhism, which had originated in India, traveled along the Silk Road into Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. In China, Buddhist scriptures, which were originally written in Sanskrit, were translated into Chinese using paper as the medium. These translations had a profound impact on the spread of Buddhism throughout East Asia. Similarly, Christian missionaries and Islamic traders used the trade routes of the Silk Road to spread their respective religions to new regions, using written scriptures and religious texts as tools for conversion and education. By the time the Mongol Empire rose in the 13th century, the Silk Road had reached its peak as a bridge for cultural and intellectual exchange. The Mongol Empire, which stretched across much of Eurasia, connected the East and the West like never before. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongols created a vast trade network that allowed goods, technologies, and ideas to flow freely from China to Europe. The Mongols also facilitated the transmission of Chinese paper-making technology to Europe, ensuring that the knowledge and technologies of the East continued to shape the development of the West. Through the Silk Road, writing and paper became central to the transmission of ideas, the exchange of knowledge, and the advancement of civilizations across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. From the earliest oracle bone inscriptions in China to the printing presses of Europe, the written word traveled across the world, transforming not only the way people communicated but also the way they understood and shared knowledge. The spread of paper along the Silk Road was not just a transmission of a material, but a conduit for the exchange of ideas and cultural practices that would shape civilizations for centuries. As paper began to spread westward from China, through Central Asia, and into the Islamic world, it fundamentally transformed the way knowledge was shared, recorded, and preserved. The evolution of this technology would lead to an intellectual revolution that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance in Europe and the scientific and cultural flourishing of the modern world. By the 9th century, papermaking had found its way into Baghdad, the intellectual heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, where it would become an essential tool for the flourishing of Islamic scholarship. The House of Wisdom, a great center for translation and intellectual pursuit, became the site where ancient Greek, Roman, and Persian texts were translated into Arabic, ensuring that the knowledge of the classical world was preserved and expanded upon. Paper, now being used extensively in the Islamic world, allowed for the mass production of these texts, making them more accessible to a wider range of scholars. As Arabic calligraphy became more refined, Quranic manuscripts were produced with exceptional precision, often embellished with elaborate designs. These sacred manuscripts were treated with reverence, but the writing of scientific and philosophical texts also flourished. The impact of papermaking was profound. Paper allowed for more frequent and widespread sharing of ideas, enabling intellectual advancements in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Arabic translations of Greek philosophical works, such as those by Aristotle, Plato, and Galileo, would influence European thinkers centuries later. The Islamic Golden Age, nurtured by the widespread use of paper and the creation of libraries and schools, was pivotal in the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi would influence the medical knowledge of Europe, while mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundation for algebra. These texts, which had been written and copied on paper, would serve as the intellectual groundwork for the European Renaissance. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Mongol Empire, a vast territory stretching from China to Europe, created the final link in the chain that connected the East and West. Genghis Khan's conquests created the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace that allowed trade, culture, and knowledge to flow freely across Eurasia. The Mongols were instrumental in the dissemination of not just papermaking but also the printing press technology. The Mongol Empire facilitated the movement of scholars, merchants, and artisans, allowing for the exchange of new technologies, including movable type printing. As paper and printing technology spread to the West, it would ignite an intellectual revolution. By the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg, a German inventor, would use the knowledge brought from Asia to create the movable type printing press. Gutenberg's press revolutionized the way books were produced, making them more affordable and accessible to a much wider audience. This technological breakthrough would lead to the rapid spread of knowledge and ideas, particularly in Europe, where the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Reformation would unfold. Printing, which began with religious texts such as the Bible, soon spread to other types of literature, including scientific treatises, philosophical works, and literature. The availability of printed books transformed the intellectual landscape of Europe. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, for example, were printed and distributed widely, contributing to the Protestant Reformation and the fragmentation of the Catholic Church. The printing press enabled the spread of ideas at an unprecedented scale, leading to the democratization of knowledge and the birth of a more informed public. Meanwhile, in China, the use of paper continued to evolve. Printing technology in China, which had been developed as early as the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, was later refined and spread throughout the country. The Chinese had been using woodblock printing since the 9th century, creating some of the world's earliest printed texts. These early Chinese printed books, which were often religious or philosophical in nature, laid the foundation for the mass production of literature that would sweep across the world. Paper remained the key medium for printing, allowing for the widespread dissemination of ideas, religious texts, and literature. The cultural and intellectual exchange along the Silk Road, facilitated by the use of paper, helped to bridge the gap between the East and West, connecting civilizations that had once been separated by vast distances. The use of writing and printing allowed ideas to travel across continents, helping to create a shared intellectual space that was enriched by different cultural and philosophical traditions. Ideas from the East, such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, intertwined with Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian theology, creating a rich tapestry of thought that would shape the course of history. The spread of paper through the Islamic world and into Europe marked a transformative moment in the history of knowledge. Not only did it revolutionize the way religious and intellectual ideas were shared, but it also made knowledge more accessible to people from different walks of life. By the time the printing press was invented, the intellectual foundation for modern science, literature, and education had been laid, and Europe was poised for its intellectual explosion during the Renaissance. Through the Silk Road, paper was more than just a material. It was a vehicle for the exchange of knowledge that connected civilizations, bridged cultural divides, and ultimately transformed the world. As paper, printing, and writing technologies spread from China to the West, they facilitated the global dissemination of ideas, shaping the modern world and creating an interconnected global culture of learning. As the world transitioned from the ancient to the medieval period, the great civilizations of the Islamic Golden Age emerged as a major force in the preservation and expansion of knowledge. From the 8th century to the 14th century, the Islamic world became a beacon of intellectual achievement, as scholars and scribes dedicated themselves to the task of translating, preserving, and advancing the knowledge of the classical world. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the cultural heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, became the center of this intellectual revolution. It was here, in the grand libraries and academies of Baghdad, that many of the greatest works of Greek philosophy, Persian science, and Indian mathematics were preserved and expanded upon. The Islamic scholars, many of whom were also scribes, played a pivotal role in ensuring that the ancient knowledge of Greece and Rome did not fade into obscurity, but instead served as the foundation for the intellectual developments of the Islamic world and later, Europe. Islamic scholars and scribes took it upon themselves to translate and transcribe a vast array of texts from Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and Persian into Arabic. This process was more than just translation. It was an intellectual endeavor to preserve and expand upon the ideas contained in these ancient works. Philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato, whose works had been largely forgotten in the West, were revived and studied by scholars in the Islamic world. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were also subjects that flourished during this period, thanks to the efforts of Islamic scholars. Al-Khwarizmi, a Persian mathematician and astronomer, is one of the most famous figures from this intellectual revolution. He is often referred to as the father of algebra, and his book on algebra laid the groundwork for modern mathematics. His work, written in Arabic and preserved by Islamic scribes, would later be translated into Latin and spread across Europe, eventually influencing the development of mathematics in the West. Alongside algebra, Islamic scholars made significant advances in geometry, trigonometry, and optics. Al-Hazan, Ibn al-Haytham, for example, is credited with being the first to formulate the scientific method of empirical observation in the field of optics. His work on light and vision was groundbreaking, and his writings on the subject influenced later European scholars such as Roger Bacon and Johannes Kepler. In the field of medicine, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a medical encyclopedia that became the standard textbook in Europe for centuries. His work was based on the medical knowledge of ancient Greece and Persia, but it also contained many original contributions. His medical theories and methods, preserved and transmitted by Islamic scribes, shaped the practice of medicine in both the Islamic world and Europe. But it wasn't just science and mathematics that flourished during the Islamic Golden Age. Literature, philosophy, and theology also thrived, as scholars sought to integrate Islamic teachings with the classical knowledge they had preserved. Philosophers such as Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Khaldun wrote extensively on the nature of reason, society, and government. Their works became foundational texts in the study of political theory, ethics, and sociology. The House of Wisdom and other intellectual centers in cities like Cairo, Cordoba, and Granada became hubs of learning, where scholars from across the Islamic world gathered to exchange ideas. Books written by hand on papyrus, parchment, and later paper were produced in large quantities and stored in libraries. These manuscripts were meticulously copied and decorated by scribes, many of whom were highly skilled calligraphers. The work of the scribe was not merely to reproduce the text, it was to preserve it with precision and beauty, ensuring that the knowledge contained within it would endure for generations. The role of the scribe in the Islamic world was not limited to copying texts. Scribes were often highly educated individuals, well-versed in both language and science, who could contribute to the development of new ideas and theories. Their ability to read, write, and transcribe in multiple languages made them essential to the intellectual life of the Islamic world. The act of writing itself was viewed as a sacred duty, and scribes took great care in the presentation of the texts they worked on. Many Islamic manuscripts are renowned for their ornate calligraphy and elaborate illustrations, which reflect the deep reverence with which the written word was treated. Islamic scholars also contributed to the preservation and development of other forms of knowledge, such as history and geography. Scholars such as Ibn Battuta, who traveled extensively across the Islamic world and beyond, wrote detailed accounts of his travels, providing invaluable insights into the cultures and peoples he encountered. His work, Rila, became a key historical source for understanding the world of the 14th century. The influence of the Islamic Golden Age on the development of Western thought is profound. As Islamic scholars translated and preserved classical texts, they helped to preserve the foundations of Western philosophy, science, and literature. When these texts were later translated into Latin during the 12th century, they sparked the intellectual revival that led to the Renaissance. The writings of Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Hazan were rediscovered by European scholars and integrated into the emerging fields of philosophy, medicine, and physics. As the intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age rippled across continents, the flow of knowledge along the Silk Road and through intellectual centers like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo helped shape the course of Western civilization. The Arab scholars who preserved, expanded, and innovated upon the knowledge of Greece, Rome, and Persia laid the foundation for the Renaissance in Europe. The journey of intellectual exchange began as Islamic scholars translated and preserved the Greek philosophical texts that had been all but lost to the West. Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, whose works had influenced Roman thought, were translated into Arabic by scholars such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna. These Arabic translations would later become the basis for European scholars' rediscovery of Greek philosophy. This exchange was not limited to philosophy alone. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were equally influenced by the intellectual pursuits of the Islamic world. The mathematical works of al-Khwarizmi, for example, had a lasting impact on the development of algebra in the West. His book of algebra was translated into Latin in the 12th century, laying the foundation for the development of modern mathematics in Europe. The scientific methods developed by Islamic scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, who is often regarded as the father of optics, were passed on to European thinkers like Roger Bacon, Leonardo da Vinci, and Galileo, influencing modern science. In the field of medicine, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine became one of the most important texts in European universities throughout the Middle Ages. His comprehensive compilation of medical knowledge, including the study of anatomy, diseases, and treatment methods, would influence the study of medicine in the West for centuries. Ibn Rayzes, another significant figure from the Islamic Golden Age, was instrumental in advancing pediatrics and ophthalmology, fields that would later blossom in Europe. Islamic scholars, however, did not only preserve and translate knowledge, they expanded upon it. The concept of empiricism, which emphasized observation and experimentation, was championed by figures like Ibn al-Haytham. His work on the nature of light and optics laid the groundwork for the scientific method that would later define European research. The concept of empirical research, pioneered by Islamic scholars, provided Europe with the intellectual tools needed for the eventual scientific revolution. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad and the great libraries and schools of Islamic Spain, notably Córdoba, became centers of intellectual exchange, not just for scholars from the Islamic world, but also for those from Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. These centers of learning were a melting pot of knowledge, where scholars from different backgrounds worked side by side, translating texts from different languages, exchanging ideas, and pushing the boundaries of human understanding. This intellectual exchange was a bridge between the classical world and the medieval world. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve the knowledge of the ancients, they expanded it, incorporating their own discoveries and creating new knowledge that would help shape the future. Their work was crucial to the eventual intellectual revival in Europe. As the Islamic world preserved and developed knowledge, Europe began to experience a period of relative intellectual stagnation following the fall of the Roman Empire. However, by the 11th and 12th centuries, Europe was ready to engage with the wisdom that had been preserved by Islamic scholars. The Crusades, which brought Christian knights into contact with the Islamic world, played a key role in opening up trade routes and intellectual exchange. European scholars who encountered the vast libraries of Córdoba, Cairo, and Baghdad began to translate Arabic texts back into Latin. This marked the beginning of a cultural renaissance that would ultimately lead to the Renaissance. The first wave of translation from Arabic into Latin began in Toledo, Spain, where the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexisted and collaborated. Scholars in Toledo translated scientific, mathematical, and philosophical works into Latin, making them accessible to a broader European audience. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Avicenna were among the texts that had the greatest impact, as they became central to the scholastic thought of the medieval universities. The influx of this new knowledge would set the stage for the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance. The influence of Islamic scholars on the Renaissance is undeniable. Renaissance thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Nicolaus Copernicus, and Johannes Kepler built upon the foundations laid by scholars in the Islamic world. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, for example, was based in part on the work of Islamic astronomers like al-Battani, who had challenged the geocentric model of the universe centuries before. Similarly, the work of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle introduced reason and philosophy to the Christian world, was instrumental in the development of European Renaissance thought. His interpretations of Aristotle's logic and metaphysics helped to form the basis for scholasticism in Europe, particularly in the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, whose synthesis of faith and reason became a hallmark of medieval philosophy. While Islamic scholars contributed to nearly every field of knowledge, from medicine to astronomy, their influence on the West can be seen most clearly in the intellectual and scientific revolutions that would follow. The Renaissance was not just a revival of classical learning, but also a continuation of the intellectual tradition preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars. These scholars did not just transmit knowledge, they reshaped it, bringing new insights and methodologies that would become the foundation of modern science, philosophy, and mathematics. The scribes of the Islamic Golden Age, working tirelessly to copy, preserve, and expand upon the written word, played an essential role in shaping the intellectual history of the world. They were not just scribes, they were scholars, innovators, and philosophers. And their work continues to resonate today in every field of human inquiry. The written word had always been a powerful force, shaping civilizations, preserving knowledge, and transmitting culture. Yet, for much of history, the production of books was slow, labor-intensive, and limited to the elite. Manuscripts had to be copied by hand, often by monks in monasteries or scribes in courts, making books rare and expensive. Only the wealthiest could afford to own them, and knowledge remained a privilege of the few. That was until the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, a technological breakthrough that would change the world forever. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg, around 1440 inches Mainz, Germany, marked the beginning of the printing revolution. Gutenberg's innovation was simple but profound. He developed a movable type system, allowing individual letters and characters to be arranged and rearranged to form words and sentences. This was a significant departure from the traditional woodblock printing used in China, where entire pages had to be carved into a block of wood before they could be printed. Gutenberg's movable type allowed for faster, more efficient production of printed material, reducing the time and cost associated with book production. The first major book printed with movable type was the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455. This was a monumental achievement, one that would mark the beginning of the mass production of books. The Gutenberg Bible was not only a technical triumph, but also a cultural and intellectual revolution. With the printing press, books became more accessible to a broader audience, breaking down the barriers that had previously confined knowledge to the wealthy elite. The ability to reproduce books quickly and cheaply meant that ideas, once limited to handwritten manuscripts, could now be shared across vast distances and among all levels of society. The impact of the printing press on religion was immediate and profound. The Christian Church, which had long held authority over the interpretation of the Bible, now found itself challenged by the rapid spread of printed texts. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, a list of criticisms against the Catholic Church, was one of the first major works to be printed and distributed widely. Luther's call for reform, based on his belief in justification by faith alone and the authority of the Bible, quickly spread throughout Europe, sparking the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation would not have been possible without the printing press. Before its invention, Luther's writings might have been confined to a small circle of intellectuals and church officials. But with the printing press, his ideas were disseminated quickly and efficiently, reaching audiences across Europe. Within just a few years, Luther's works had been translated into multiple languages and had inspired religious upheaval in countries ranging from Germany to England to Switzerland. This intellectual shift also contributed to the rise of individualism, as people could now access the scriptures and interpret them for themselves, outside the authority of the Church. The printing press not only played a crucial role in the Protestant Reformation, but also in the scientific revolution. Just as Luther used the printed word to challenge religious authority, scientists would use it to challenge ancient ideas about the natural world. With the printing press, scientific discoveries could be shared quickly, leading to an explosion of intellectual activity in the 16th and 17th centuries. Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, used printed books to share his groundbreaking theory that the Earth revolved around the Sun, challenging the centuries-old geocentric model upheld by the Church. The publication of Galileo's observations through a telescope, which supported Copernicus's heliocentric theory, was another key moment in the dissemination of new ideas. With the printing press, scientific knowledge could be shared far and wide, leading to the eventual overthrow of many ancient ideas and the birth of modern science. The printing press also played a key role in the spread of philosophy and political theory. Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, a treatise on political power, was printed and widely distributed, influencing rulers and intellectuals across Europe. The ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau also spread quickly through printed works, influencing revolutionary movements in both America and France. Not only did the printing press revolutionize the dissemination of ideas in religion and science, but it also transformed the way people thought about education and literacy. Before the printing press, literacy rates were low, and books were rare. But with the mass production of books, knowledge became more accessible. The spread of printed material allowed for an increase in literacy, as people had access to books, pamphlets, newspapers, and brochures, printed materials that educated and informed the masses. Public education systems, which had previously been reserved for the elite, began to expand, and literacy became a more widespread skill. The newspapers that emerged in the 17th century, for instance, became a key part of modern political life. The press played a crucial role in shaping public opinion, providing people with the information they needed to participate in democratic life. The ability to print news, opinions, and political discourse allowed for a new kind of public sphere, one in which ordinary people could discuss ideas and influence government. The printing revolution created a global exchange of knowledge, and the effects of this revolution were felt not just in Europe, but throughout the world. Colonial powers used printed books to spread their influence to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, bringing European ideas to distant lands. Printed Bibles, encyclopedias, and philosophical works became central to the development of colonial education systems, and the exchange of knowledge between the Old World and the New World began to shape modern society. The printing press, by making the written word widely available, sparked a revolution in culture, politics, and intellectual life. It democratized knowledge, and in doing so, it helped to shape the world as we know it today. The printing revolution, ignited by Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press, laid the foundation for the modern world. It created an intellectual and cultural transformation that not only accelerated the spread of knowledge, but also radically changed the course of human history. While Gutenberg's invention had an immediate impact on the spread of religious ideas, especially during the Protestant Reformation, its influence stretched far beyond theology and religious reform, permeating the realms of literature, science, politics, and even social structure. With the advent of printing technology, the Renaissance saw a massive surge in the production of books and manuscripts, making knowledge more accessible than ever before. What had once been the exclusive domain of the elite monks, scholars, and aristocrats now spread to the middle and lower classes. The printed word empowered individuals, educated them, and ultimately transformed entire societies. In literature, the printing press facilitated the rapid spread of new ideas. The works of Shakespeare, Cervantes, and other literary giants were printed and disseminated far more widely than their manuscripts would have allowed. Before the press, books were precious and costly, often hand-copied by scribes. Now, thanks to mass production, the works of great authors were not only accessible to the wealthy but also to common people. This democratization of literature encouraged a new literary culture and paved the way for the flourishing of novels, poetry, and theater. Shakespeare's plays, for example, which were first performed on the stage, were later printed and became available to a global audience. This allowed the playwright's work to endure beyond the constraints of time and place. As the printed text spread, Shakespeare's influence became a global phenomenon. Inspiring generations of writers and thinkers, the printing press also played a critical role in the development of scientific knowledge. Copernicus's work on the heliocentric theory, which argued that the Earth revolved around the Sun, would have likely remained a fringe idea had it not been for the advent of printing. By printing and distributing his theories, Copernicus was able to spread his revolutionary ideas across Europe, challenging the centuries-old geocentric worldview upheld by the Church. Similarly, Galileo Galilei, using the printing press, disseminated his observations about the nature of the universe, including his advocacy for the heliocentric model. Galileo's books, such as Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, were printed and became instrumental in changing how humanity viewed the cosmos. The ability to print books quickly allowed these scientific theories to spread beyond small circles of intellectuals to a much broader audience, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution. In the realm of medicine, printed books became a crucial tool in the development of modern medical science. Works by Andreas Vesalius on human anatomy, William Harvey on blood circulation, and others were printed and circulated, helping to establish a more accurate understanding of the human body. The printed word allowed medical knowledge to be shared across continents, leading to faster advancements in healthcare and more effective treatments. The impact of the printing press extended far beyond the Renaissance and scientific revolution. As newspapers began to be printed in the 16th and 17th centuries, they transformed the way people consumed information. News previously delivered by word of mouth or through royal proclamations was now accessible to the masses. This shift was revolutionary, providing ordinary people with the power to learn about political events, economic changes, and social issues. The printing of pamphlets, which circulated information quickly and cheaply, gave rise to the public sphere, where ideas could be discussed freely by anyone with access to printed material. In politics, the printing press played a pivotal role in shaping modern governance. The pamphlets produced during the English Civil War, for instance, allowed political ideas to be disseminated to a wider public than ever before. The American Revolution was similarly fueled by the printed word, with pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense galvanizing public support for independence from Britain. The spread of political literature through printed works made it easier for reformers to organize and mobilize citizens to challenge existing power structures. The French Revolution, too, benefited from the proliferation of printed materials. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Baron de Montesquieu had their works printed and distributed, spreading their ideas of democracy, equality, and individual rights throughout Europe. These ideas, disseminated widely thanks to the press, would inspire the revolutionary movements in France and America, ultimately shaping the modern political landscape. The impact of the printing press extended into education as well. In the centuries after its invention, literacy rates soared across Europe. Printed textbooks and learning materials made it possible for people to educate themselves independently of formal schooling. The rapid spread of scientific, literary, and religious knowledge meant that a wider swath of the population could be educated, leading to a more informed citizenry. The printing press made possible the birth of mass communication. Just as it democratized knowledge, it also democratized access to information. The rise of newspapers, journals, and books meant that public opinion could now be shaped on a massive scale. Over time, this led to the development of media as we know it today, where print, and later digital, technologies allowed for global reach and influence. However, the influence of the printing press was not confined to Europe alone. As European powers began to colonize the Americas, printing technology spread to the New World. The first newspapers in the Americas were published in Mexico and the English colonies, and printed books became a key component of colonial education systems. The spread of printed materials throughout the Americas helped shape the intellectual culture of the New World, influencing both the colonial elite and ordinary citizens. The printing revolution did not just create a new way of spreading knowledge, it also created a new way of thinking. The ability to circulate ideas freely and efficiently fostered a culture of inquiry and debate. The printing press facilitated the spread of Renaissance humanism, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the development of modern democratic thought. It made the written word not only more accessible but also more powerful than ever before. The Renaissance, which began in the 14th century and continued into the 17th century, was a period of unprecedented intellectual and artistic flourishing in Europe. One of the driving forces behind this cultural explosion was the widespread availability of printed books, which made classical knowledge more accessible than ever before. Yet, while the printing press played a crucial role, the earlier traditions of calligraphy and manuscript illumination continued to influence European thought and culture during this period, especially in the early days of the Renaissance. In the decades following the Gutenberg printing revolution, the role of the scribe and calligrapher did not disappear. Rather, these artisans found themselves working alongside printers to produce texts that were both useful and aesthetic. Manuscripts were still highly prized, particularly those that were beautifully written or illuminated. The art of calligraphy, which had been practiced for centuries, continued to evolve, with different regions in Europe developing their own distinct styles of writing. In Italy, humanist calligraphy became a hallmark of Renaissance manuscripts, while Gothic script persisted in regions like Germany. The humanists, who believed in the revival of ancient Greek and Roman ideals, were instrumental in the Renaissance's intellectual revival. They saw classical texts as essential to the advancement of society and sought to preserve and disseminate the works of the ancients. Many of these texts were copied by hand in the tradition of the scribes, and the skills of calligraphy were essential in ensuring the readability and beauty of the manuscripts. Humanist scholars like Petrarch, Leonardo Bruni, and Desiderius Erasmus were at the forefront of this effort, producing works that would lay the foundation for the intellectual currents that would sweep across Europe. However, the introduction of the printing press meant that books could now be reproduced more quickly and more affordably than ever before. Printed books became increasingly popular, and by the early 16th century, the cost of owning books was dramatically reduced, making them more accessible to a wider audience. This democratization of knowledge was a game-changer for Europe, as it led to the proliferation of ideas and the rapid exchange of knowledge across national borders. The spread of printed books facilitated the rapid expansion of Renaissance humanism, which placed an emphasis on education, reason, and the study of the classics. The newly printed books, which included works by Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle, were instrumental in the formation of the modern university. Scholars could now read the ancient texts for themselves and engage in a more direct and open form of intellectual discourse. At the same time, the printing press was instrumental in the dissemination of scientific knowledge. Copernicus's heliocentric theory challenged the long-held view that the Earth was the center of the universe, and his work, along with the works of Galileo and Kepler, would lay the foundation for modern astronomy. The ability to print and distribute their scientific findings meant that these revolutionary ideas could spread far beyond their original intellectual circles, transforming how people understood the cosmos. In addition to the Renaissance and scientific revolution, the discovery and colonization of the Americas had a profound effect on the development of global knowledge. As European explorers and colonizers traveled to the New World, they encountered peoples, cultures, and ideas that were completely foreign to them. The written word played a central role in the transmission of knowledge between the Old World and the New World. Printed books, particularly travelogues, maps, and missionary texts, were instrumental in shaping European understanding of the Americas and its peoples. Colonial knowledge was often gathered and recorded by missionaries, explorers, and merchants, who wrote detailed accounts of their experiences. These writings, which were often printed and circulated in Europe, helped shape the European imagination of the New World. Missionary texts, which sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, were particularly influential. They were often printed in local languages, enabling European powers to communicate with and educate the colonized populations. As the colonial powers expanded their empires, they also brought European knowledge to the Americas. Books on agriculture, law, and medicine were printed and distributed to European settlers and administrators, helping to establish colonial systems of governance. The printing press allowed these texts to be spread far and wide, creating a new form of intellectual and political hegemony that extended across continents. However, the colonial exchange of knowledge was not one-sided. The New World also introduced new forms of knowledge to the Old World, particularly in the fields of botany, medicine, and geography. The discovery of new plants such as tobacco, potatoes, and corn had a profound effect on European agriculture and cuisine. Medical texts from indigenous cultures, such as those related to herbal remedies, were also recorded and translated into European languages, contributing to the development of new medical treatments. Despite the unequal power dynamics inherent in colonialism, the exchange of knowledge during this period laid the foundation for the globalization of knowledge. Printed books helped to spread new ideas and technologies, creating a more interconnected world. As European powers continued to expand their empires, the printing press played a key role in the dissemination of their culture, science, and philosophy across the globe. As the printing press continued to spread its influence across the globe, the dynamics of knowledge exchange became increasingly complex, particularly in the context of colonialism. The colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia by European powers reshaped not only political and economic systems, but also the intellectual and cultural landscape. The written word, whether in the form of books, maps, scientific treatises, or religious texts, played a pivotal role in the expansion of European knowledge and the dissemination of ideas throughout the newly established empires. In the Americas, the printing press became a powerful tool for both control and communication. As European powers sought to consolidate their authority over vast territories, the written word was used to enforce colonial rule. Laws, decrees, and treatises were printed in the colonial languages Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French to establish systems of governance, enforce religious conversions, and standardize trade practices. The missionary effort to convert indigenous populations to Christianity was often supported by printed religious texts, such as the Bible and prayers translated into local languages. In addition to these religious efforts, colonial administrators and scholars in the New World recorded their observations about the indigenous peoples and lands they encountered. Travelogues, maps, and scientific writings documented the rich biodiversity, landscapes, and cultures of the Americas. These documents, often printed and widely distributed in Europe, helped to shape the European imagination of the New World. However, the knowledge conveyed in these texts was often distorted or filtered through the lens of European colonial perspectives. European explorers and missionaries often saw themselves as the bearers of civilization and enlightenment, while many indigenous cultures were dismissed as primitive or backward. Nevertheless, the written accounts produced by Europeans, whether scientific reports on the flora and fauna of the Americas or religious texts aimed at conversion, played a significant role in the global exchange of knowledge. Indigenous knowledge systems, especially in areas like medicine, agriculture, and astronomy, were often overshadowed by the dominance of Western ideas. However, these indigenous systems were also documented and occasionally incorporated into European thought. The spread of printing technology in colonial settings was not one-sided. As European settlers began to establish permanent colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they came into contact with indigenous knowledge systems that had developed over centuries. In many cases, these cultures possessed sophisticated systems of knowledge in areas such as agriculture, medicine, and navigation, which were critical to survival in the New World. For example, in South America, indigenous peoples had long cultivated crops like potatoes and maize, which were later introduced to Europe and became essential to European diets. The herbal remedies used by indigenous people in the Americas were recorded by European botanists and later used in European medicine. Similarly, African and Asian agricultural practices, including the use of irrigation and crop rotation, were studied by colonial authorities and sometimes incorporated into European farming techniques. In the Asian colonies, particularly in India and China, knowledge exchange was more reciprocal. European traders, missionaries, and scholars had to learn local languages and customs in order to establish relationships with local populations. Printed texts in Arabic, Persian, Hindi, and Mandarin were produced and translated as part of efforts to understand local cultures, philosophies, and religions. This linguistic exchange helped to bridge the gap between European knowledge and the ancient intellectual traditions of the East. The printing press in these colonial regions not only facilitated the dissemination of European knowledge, but also allowed indigenous intellectual traditions to be recorded and preserved. The missionary effort in Asia, for example, involved the production of printed materials in local languages that helped spread Christian teachings but also incorporated elements of indigenous cultures. Over time, these printed works began to influence global religious thought, contributing to the eventual emergence of interfaith dialogue and an exchange of ideas between East and West. In the 19th century, the spread of colonial knowledge through printed works played an important role in the development of imperial education systems in colonized regions. European powers established schools and universities in their colonies to educate the local elite in Western ideals. Printed textbooks, scientific journals, and philosophical treatises were central to the curriculum, shaping the colonial intellectual landscape. However, these systems of education were also criticized for reinforcing colonial rule and promoting European ideals at the expense of indigenous cultures and knowledge systems. While the colonial powers spread their own ideas through printed works, they also encountered the resistance of indigenous scholars and intellectuals who sought to preserve and promote their own traditions. Nationalist movements in colonized countries were often driven by the desire to reclaim indigenous knowledge and challenge the colonial order. Printed texts played an essential role in these movements, as pamphlets, newspapers, and books were used to mobilize the masses and promote the ideals of independence and self-determination. The influence of the printing press during the colonial period was not confined to the Western world or the colonized regions. It was part of a larger, global shift in how knowledge was produced, distributed, and consumed. By the time independence movements gained momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries, the written word, especially in the form of printed books, pamphlets, and journals, had become a powerful tool for political and social change. This colonial knowledge exchange through printed materials, although deeply embedded in power dynamics and colonial control, also allowed for the preservation and dissemination of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. The intersection of European and indigenous knowledge systems created a complex intellectual landscape that continues to shape the world today. The 18th and 19th centuries marked a period of unprecedented technological advancement. The Industrial Revolution revolutionized nearly every aspect of human life, from agriculture to manufacturing, and profoundly impacted the ways people communicated and shared knowledge. One of the most transformative developments during this period was the evolution of printing technology, which not only made books more affordable and accessible, but also played a critical role in shaping modern mass communication. While Gutenberg's printing press had set the foundation for the spread of knowledge in the 15th century, it was the mechanization of printing during the Industrial Age that truly transformed the production of written material. The invention of the steam-powered printing press in the early 19th century, followed by the development of the rotary press in the mid-19th century, significantly increased the speed and efficiency of printing. These innovations allowed newspapers, books, and pamphlets to be produced at an unprecedented scale, making printed material accessible to a growing middle class and even working class populations. The rotary printing press was a breakthrough in printing technology, allowing for the mass production of materials at a fraction of the cost and time it took with earlier methods. This press, which used a continuous roll of paper and could print on both sides of the paper simultaneously, was capable of printing thousands of copies in a single hour. The printing of newspapers and magazines became quicker, cheaper, and more efficient, and the resulting surge in printed material helped to shape the culture and economy of the industrialized world. Newspapers, in particular, underwent a dramatic transformation during this period. As printing technology improved, the cost of producing newspapers dropped, allowing them to be sold at a price that was affordable for a broader audience. By the early 19th century, mass circulation newspapers were emerging in cities across Europe and America. The penny press, a term used to describe the affordable, widely circulated newspapers of the time, made news more accessible to the working class. These newspapers, which were sold for a penny, contained information about politics, sports, social events, and even entertainment, and became central to the daily lives of millions. The rise of the newspaper industry during the Industrial Age not only contributed to the democratization of knowledge, but also played a pivotal role in the development of public opinion. For the first time in history, ordinary people had access to news about national and international events, and the mass circulation of newspapers helped to shape public consciousness. It was during this period that the idea of journalism as a profession began to emerge. The role of the journalist, whose job was to inform, investigate, and comment on current events, became central to the functioning of modern democratic societies. Along with the growth of newspapers came the expansion of literacy. The Industrial Revolution brought about significant changes in the way people lived and worked, and one of the key consequences was the expansion of public education. As literacy rates soared, more and more people were able to read newspapers, books, and pamphlets, which, in turn, fueled a growing demand for printed material. Books became more affordable, and the rise of cheap paperbacks made literature more accessible to the masses. This had a profound effect on culture, as more people were exposed to a wide range of ideas, philosophies, and entertainment. The rise of the novel, for example, was a direct result of the expanded access to books and the growing popularity of reading among the middle and working classes. Authors such as Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, and Mark Twain reached an unprecedented audience, and their works were read not just by the elite but by ordinary people. The novel became one of the most popular forms of entertainment and reflection of social reality, and it played a key role in the formation of modern literature. The Industrial Age of writing was also a period of remarkable growth in education. With the rise of public schools and universities, access to education became more widespread, and textbooks were produced in ever-increasing numbers to meet the demand. The ability to mass-produce educational material made learning more accessible to people of all social classes, and the printed word became a central tool in the spread of knowledge. Books were no longer luxury items reserved for the wealthy. They were now part of everyday life for millions of people. Libraries and bookstores became more common, and reading became a popular pastime for the general public. The expansion of literacy and the availability of books played a significant role in the spread of democratic ideals, as people were exposed to new ideas about politics, government, and society. The Industrial Age of writing also saw the development of educational publishing, which became a significant industry in its own right. The mass production of textbooks, from elementary school readers to college-level texts, provided the intellectual foundation for an increasingly educated populace. This era saw the rise of publishing houses dedicated to producing academic texts, as well as the creation of educational materials for vocational training and professional development. The impact of mass communication during this time extended beyond literature and news. The printed word also played a significant role in the growth of advertising. With the rise of newspapers, magazines, and later billboards and catalogs, businesses could reach a broader audience than ever before. Advertising, which had once been confined to handbills or word of mouth, became a key component of the consumer economy. Advertising agencies were established, and printed materials such as brochures, catalogs, and flyers became central to marketing products and services. The growth of the printing press and newspaper industry was a defining feature of the Industrial Revolution, and its influence on society cannot be overstated. It helped shape the political, social, and economic landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries, and it laid the foundation for the modern media landscape we have today. As printing technology continued to evolve, it allowed for an explosion of information, knowledge, and culture that reached unprecedented levels of accessibility. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the development of printing technology evolved beyond the traditional methods of mechanical presses, moving toward the world we recognize today with the rise of modern media and the influence of digital technologies. The explosive growth in the printing industry, fueled by mechanization, was mirrored by the expansion of mass media, which helped to shape the cultural, political, and economic structures of modern societies. The 19th and early 20th centuries marked a turning point, where print technology transitioned from steam-powered presses to more advanced systems that could produce even more copies faster and with greater precision. The arrival of offset printing and photo engraving led to more efficient mass production of newspapers, books, and magazines, contributing to the rise of an increasingly globalized media landscape. The printed word, once reserved for the elite, now reached millions of people from all walks of life, reshaping culture and public life. Mass media, especially newspapers, magazines, and books, began to dominate public discourse, providing news and entertainment to broad sections of the population. As a result, the role of the journalist, editor, and publisher evolved into essential parts of modern society. Newspapers, which had already flourished in the 19th century, became key instruments in the shaping of public opinion. They allowed for greater democratization of information, giving people access to the latest political events, international news, and social happenings. The printed press not only informed the public, but also served as a powerful tool for social change and political movements. In the early 20th century, as radio and television emerged, the printing press still held significant influence over how information was produced and consumed. Books continued to be a central part of education and entertainment, and newspapers, though eventually challenged by newer technologies, retained their role as key sources of mass communication. The printed word's persistence in these early media outlets demonstrated its lasting power to shape both public consciousness and private lives. One of the most significant cultural shifts during the industrial age was the democratization of literacy. The expansion of public education was accelerated by the printing press, as more people gained access to printed textbooks and learning materials. This spread of knowledge led to higher literacy rates, not only in Europe and North America, but also across the globe. By the 20th century, literacy was a basic right and a key component of social mobility. The printed word, once confined to a select few, had now become a tool of empowerment for millions. However, as technology continued to evolve, the rapid growth of printing technology encountered new challenges and opportunities. The arrival of the digital revolution in the late 20th century marked another significant shift in how knowledge and information were disseminated. The Internet became a central platform for information exchange, allowing people to access books, news, and entertainment on a scale that traditional print media could not match. Despite the rise of digital media, the legacy of the printed word persists. Print books, newspapers, and magazines continue to be central to global culture, albeit in a transformed form. The advent of ebooks, online newspapers, and digital magazines has made the written word more accessible than ever before, allowing people to read anywhere and at any time. While traditional printing presses have adapted to digital technologies, the fundamental role of print in shaping how we communicate, think, and learn remains unchanged. Moreover, as print and digital media converge, the world is experiencing a new media revolution. The Internet allows people to engage with text in ways that print never could through hyperlinks, videos, and interactive content. Yet, the power of the written word, whether printed or digital, remains a key driver of cultural and intellectual exchange. With social media platforms now being used for journalistic purposes, news can be shared globally in seconds. But this rapid sharing often requires a careful consideration of authenticity and credibility in the information we consume. Today, the printing industry faces a variety of challenges, especially with the rise of digital communication and self-publishing platforms. The traditional model of book publishing has evolved into a more decentralized system where anyone with access to the internet can publish and distribute their writing. This shift has transformed the publishing world, allowing for greater diversity in literature and new voices to be heard. Self-published authors can now reach global audiences with just a click, bypassing traditional publishers and print media. At the same time, the decline of printed newspapers and the move to online media has had a profound effect on the way news is consumed. With the rise of social media, news is shared at an unprecedented speed. But the challenge now lies in discerning fact from fiction. While print media once served as the primary means for curated, professional journalism, digital platforms have opened the floodgates to a democratized but sometimes chaotic flow of information. The challenges facing traditional print media have led to a fundamental shift in the role of journalism in society. The traditional model of journalism, based on long-form, in-depth investigative reporting, is being replaced by faster, more immediate forms of communication. The speed of information transmission in the digital age has created both benefits and drawbacks, forcing newspapers and magazines to rethink their strategies to stay relevant. Yet, the enduring legacy of the printing press continues to shape our world. It laid the groundwork for the development of mass communication, the democratization of knowledge, and the empowerment of individuals through access to information. The printed word has influenced political revolutions, scientific advancements, and social movements, and it continues to play a central role in how we understand and interact with the world. The rise of digital technology has brought about a radical shift in how we produce, distribute, and consume written content. While the printing press of the 15th century revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge and paved the way for the industrial age of writing, the digital revolution has brought a new set of challenges and opportunities in the 21st century. Today, we are experiencing a profound transformation in how knowledge is shared, archived, and even understood. Unlike the industrial age, which was characterized by the mass production of printed materials like books, newspapers, and magazines, the digital age has given birth to an entirely new ecosystem of electronic and online media. The printed word, once confined to the physical page, has migrated into the digital realm, where it can be shared instantly across the globe. E-books, online news, and blogs have replaced traditional printed materials, allowing for the immediacy of information exchange and a global reach previously unimaginable. The advent of the internet has democratized knowledge even further, providing access to information to people all over the world, at any time, from virtually any place. From Wikipedia to digital libraries like Google Books and Project Gutenberg, vast repositories of human knowledge are now available with just a few clicks. The physical limitations of print, such as the cost of production, storage, and distribution, have been replaced by the almost limitless possibilities of digital storage and transmission. This transition from ink to pixels has not been without its challenges. One of the most significant changes is how we now interact with the written word. The advent of e-readers, tablets, and smartphones has shifted reading from physical pages to digital screens. While this allows for easy access to an overwhelming amount of content, it also raises questions about focus, attention, and the preservation of literary traditions. Unlike a printed book, which encourages linear reading, digital texts often encourage fragmented multitasking experiences as readers jump from hyperlink to hyperlink. Furthermore, the shift to digital media has drastically altered how we consume news. Traditional newspapers, which were once the primary source of information for a large portion of the population, are now increasingly being replaced by digital platforms. The ability to access news instantly on websites and through social media has fundamentally changed the relationship between the reader and the news source. In many ways, the digital transformation has created a more fragmented media landscape, where news is often filtered through algorithms that prioritize content based on personal preferences and social influence, rather than editorial oversight. The speed of information transmission in the digital age is unmatched by anything seen in the past. In the 20th century, news could take hours or days to travel across continents, depending on the method of transmission. Today, news stories can break in real time, with social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram providing instantaneous updates. This instantaneous nature of digital media has led to a new era of real-time reporting, where citizens can contribute to the news cycle and where events unfold as they happen, without the mediation of traditional gatekeepers like newspapers or television stations. However, with these advancements come significant challenges in the realm of information authenticity. The rise of fake news, misinformation, and clickbait has made it increasingly difficult to navigate the digital landscape. The very tools that allow us to access information easily also make it easy to manipulate, distort, or fabricate content. The question of credibility and trust in digital media has become a central issue in the modern world. As algorithms dictate what we see and read, the ability to critically evaluate sources of information has become more important than ever. The digital age has also profoundly impacted the field of literature. While printed books still dominate the literary world, the rise of self-publishing platforms, such as Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, has created an entirely new landscape for writers. E-books are now a primary method of distribution, allowing authors to bypass traditional publishers and print houses. This democratization of publishing has given rise to a more diverse range of voices and narratives that might have been excluded from the traditional publishing process. However, the shift to digital media also raises questions about the future of print. While ebooks and online content have made significant inroads into the world of literature, printed books remain a symbol of culture and authenticity for many readers. Despite the convenience and affordability of digital texts, many readers still prefer the tactile experience of holding a printed book. The future of print, therefore, lies not in competition with digital media, but in coexistence. Print books may no longer dominate the literary world as they once did, but they continue to be cherished by collectors, bibliophiles, and readers who value the physical object as much as the content. The rise of digital media has also changed the way we share knowledge. The internet is filled with open access platforms where users can collaborate, create, and share content in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. Crowdsourcing and open source platforms have created new ways to share and disseminate knowledge. Wikipedia, for example, has become one of the world's largest and most widely accessed repositories of human knowledge, created and maintained by individuals from across the globe. Moreover, the digital age has brought about the rise of interactive content. In the past, knowledge was typically shared in a linear fashion through books, lectures, or articles. Today, interactive websites, online courses, and educational apps are transforming how we learn and engage with information. The ability to collaborate, question, and create has changed education, turning it into an active, participatory process rather than a passive consumption of facts. As we look to the future, the digital world will continue to shape the way we access, interact with, and understand knowledge. Whether it's the emergence of virtual reality, the growth of artificial intelligence and information processing, or the shift to more interactive forms of storytelling, the landscape of written knowledge will continue to evolve. Yet, as we move further into the digital age, we must also consider the preservation of knowledge, not just the content, but the form in which it exists. Will future generations have access to digital libraries, or will technological obsolescence make these repositories of knowledge disappear? How can we ensure the continuation of literacy in an increasingly visual and sensory-driven world? The journey from ink to pixels is far from over. As we move deeper into the digital continuum, it is crucial to remember the fundamental role that the written word has played in shaping human history. Whether in print or pixels, the written word remains an enduring tool for recording our thoughts, sharing our ideas, and building our collective future. As we move further into the digital age, the relationship between knowledge and the tools we use to access it is undergoing a radical transformation. The digital continuum is shaping not only how we learn, but also how we share and engage with knowledge. The written word, which once relied on physical materials like papyrus, parchment, and paper, has seamlessly transitioned into the digital realm, creating a more fluid, interactive, and accessible environment for the exchange of ideas. One of the most significant changes in how we access knowledge is the rise of interactive and immersive technologies. The development of virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, is beginning to redefine how we engage with educational content. These technologies allow for a more experiential way of learning, where individuals can immerse themselves in historical events, scientific experiments, and complex systems without the traditional boundaries of textbooks or lectures. Imagine a history lesson where you can virtually visit ancient Rome, a biology class where you can virtually navigate the human body, or a mathematics course where equations and graphs come to life in 3 dimensions. Immersive learning is not just about reading about knowledge, it's about experiencing it. These new learning tools are interactive and collaborative, enabling learners to create, manipulate, and explore knowledge in ways that were not possible before. Artificial intelligence, AI too, is playing an increasingly vital role in education. AI-powered platforms like personalized learning systems, which adapt to the individual needs of the learner, and automated tutoring, are changing how educational content is delivered. The vast wealth of information available online, combined with AI's ability to analyze and present this data, allows for a level of customization and adaptation that traditional methods of education simply cannot match. As technology continues to advance, we're seeing hybrid learning environments become more common, blending digital and traditional forms of education. Online courses from platforms like Coursera, edX, and Khan Academy allow learners to access courses from universities and instructors around the world, enabling lifelong learning. The open access movement, which promotes free access to scholarly work, is expanding, with more universities and institutions offering research and textbooks for free. This democratization of knowledge is allowing individuals from diverse backgrounds to access cutting-edge research and educational resources that were once confined to the elite. The digital shift has also made collaborative knowledge creation easier than ever. Crowdsourcing platforms like Wikipedia allow individuals from around the globe to contribute to a collective pool of knowledge. While the idea of a freely editable encyclopedia initially raised concerns about accuracy, Wikipedia has proven to be a surprisingly reliable source of information, thanks to a strong system of oversight and the input of a global community of contributors. This collaborative effort has transformed the way knowledge is created, challenged, and verified. Digital media, which includes blogs, podcasts, and open-source software, has made it easier for anyone to participate in creating, sharing, and curating knowledge. However, despite these advances, the digital age is not without its challenges. One of the most significant issues is the overabundance of information available at our fingertips. The sheer volume of content spanning everything from news articles and social media posts to academic papers and entertainment can overwhelm even the most diligent of learners. The information overload phenomenon, coupled with the misinformation that circulates online, has made it more difficult to discern credible sources from unreliable ones. Critical thinking and media literacy are now essential skills in the digital age, as individuals must be able to evaluate the accuracy and authenticity of the information they encounter. The advent of social media platforms has brought another layer of complexity to the digital continuum. While these platforms have opened up new avenues for the exchange of ideas, they have also introduced new challenges. Echo chambers, where users are exposed only to information that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs, have become a significant concern. These digital spaces often reinforce biases and limit the diversity of ideas, making it harder to foster constructive dialogue and mutual understanding. Social media has, in many ways, reshaped how knowledge is consumed, not necessarily by the quality of the information, but by how quickly and virally it spreads. The influence of influencers, opinion leaders, and viral content often distorts the value of knowledge in the digital age. As artificial intelligence continues to evolve, its integration into the digital continuum raises new possibilities for knowledge sharing. AI-driven content creation is already changing industries, from journalism to creative writing. AI is increasingly capable of generating texts, reports, and even creative works like music and art, pushing the boundaries of what is considered human-made knowledge. For instance, GPT-3, the model powering this very conversation, is capable of producing texts that mimic human writing across a variety of domains, blurring the lines between human and machine-generated content. While this presents exciting opportunities for the future, it also challenges our understanding of authorship and intellectual property. Moreover, blockchain technology is introducing new ways to preserve and share knowledge. By providing a decentralized and immutable method of recording data, blockchain allows for the secure sharing of digital content without reliance on centralized platforms. This could have profound implications for intellectual property rights in digital publishing, as creators could own and control their content directly, bypassing traditional publishing systems. As we continue to transition into a digitally dominated world, it is crucial to recognize the continuing importance of the written word. While the format may have changed from ink on paper to pixels on screens, the essence of what writing represents remains unchanged: the desire to record, share, and preserve knowledge. The digital continuum is not a replacement for traditional forms of writing, but rather an extension of them. The integration of digital tools, interactive media, and global networks has only amplified the capacity for humans to create and disseminate knowledge. Looking ahead, the future of the written word will be shaped by the fusion of digital technologies. As artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality continue to evolve, so too will the ways in which we engage with the written word. The creation of interactive literature, immersive educational experiences, and AI-generated content will continue to reshape the landscape of knowledge sharing, creating opportunities for individuals and communities to connect and learn in entirely new ways. Yet, despite all the technological advancements, the fundamental role of the written word as a means of communicating ideas, preserving knowledge, and fostering creativity will remain a cornerstone of human culture. Whether in the form of books, articles, tweets, or digital essays, the written word will continue to be one of humanity's most powerful tools for shaping the future. And with that, the journey through the history of knowledge has come to a close. From the first marks etched on cave walls to the incredible advancements of the digital age that continue to shape the world today. It's a fascinating story, one that spans centuries of human ingenuity and the desire to share, preserve, and expand our understanding. But, as anyone who has explored the evolution of writing and communication can tell you, the story is far from over. In fact, it's only just beginning. We stand at a crossroads. In a world where information is more accessible than ever before, the digital age is evolving rapidly, and with it, the ways we share knowledge, learn, and connect. From immersive technologies like VR and AI to the rise of social media platforms and digital libraries, the future of knowledge is wide open. The question now is, how will humanity continue to harness these tools to push the boundaries of discovery, creativity, and learning? For those who have been captivated by this journey, by how the printing press revolutionized the spread of knowledge, by how writing has shaped societies and cultures, there is so much more to explore. The world of knowledge is vast, and there are countless untold stories waiting to be uncovered. Every discovery, every leap in technology, opens up new frontiers for exploration. If this deep dive into history and the digital revolution has sparked curiosity, then there's plenty more ahead. To stay updated on the latest explorations into the world of knowledge, history, and technology, be sure to like the video, share it with others who would enjoy the journey, and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, one becomes part of a community that is passionate about understanding how humanity has evolved and where it is headed next. The digital age is only getting started, and the future is filled with endless possibilities. Each subscriber, each viewer, is a part of this exciting new chapter in the story of knowledge. So, why not join the conversation? Drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and become an active part of the exploration. The written word and digital technology have shaped the past, and together, we can help shape the future. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe so that you never miss a chapter in this ongoing adventure into the world of knowledge.